In September 1944, Adolf Hitler received 8 injections in a single day: methamphetamine, oxycodone, cocaine, testosterone, and substances so experimental they didn't even have names yet. This wasn't torture. This wasn't punishment. This was his doctor's daily treatment plan. The medical records show over 800 injections in just 3 years, the same 3 years when Hitler made the decisions that led to Germany's total destruction. The same 3 years when his military strategy became so irrational that his own generals thought he'd gone insane. He had. Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue producing in-depth, fact-based World War II content on a regular basis. By 1945, Hitler couldn't sign his name without his hand shaking violently. He shuffled like an old man at age 56. His left arm hung limp at his side, his eyes were glazed, his skin had turned gray, and he was still getting injected with methamphetamine every morning just to get out of bed. The doctor administering these drugs kept detailed logs of every single injection: dates, times, dosages, substances. Those logs survived the war, and when Allied doctors finally analyzed them, they realized something absolutely horrifying. The person commanding the Nazi war machine for the final 3 years wasn't just evil, he was high, constantly, on a cocktail of drugs that would kill most people. And here's the most disturbing part: Hitler had no idea. He genuinely believed these injections were keeping him healthy and sharp. He thought his doctor was a genius. He trusted him completely. That doctor's name was Theodor Morell, and what he did to Hitler's body and mind is one of the most shocking medical stories in human history, a story that helps explain why the war ended the way it did. If you want to understand the real story behind one of history's darkest chapters, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because what comes next isn't in the history textbooks. This is the hidden chemical catastrophe that changed World War II. The Nazi propaganda machine spent millions creating an image of Hitler that was a complete fabrication. Every photograph, every film, every public appearance, all carefully orchestrated to hide the truth. They showed him standing straight and tall at rallies, his voice booming with confidence. They filmed him hiking in the Bavarian Alps, supposedly enjoying nature and contemplating Germany's future. They photographed him bending down to receive flowers from blonde German children, the picture of a benevolent leader. The propaganda portrayed Hitler as a man of iron discipline, non-smoker, barely touched alcohol, vegetarian for supposed moral reasons, worked 18 hours a day without complaint, slept only a few hours a night because of his dedication to the German people. This image wasn't just propaganda, it was essential to Nazi ideology. The Führer had to be superhuman. He had to embody Aryan perfection. Physical weakness wasn't just unacceptable, it was impossible. The man chosen by destiny to lead Germany into a 1,000-year Reich couldn't be sick. So they hid everything. They hid the chronic stomach pain that had plagued Hitler since his 20s. They hid the insomnia that left him pacing his room at 3 a.m. They hid the digestive problems so severe that he would sweat through his uniform from the pain. They hid the hypochondria that made him obsessed with every minor symptom. The official story was that Hitler was in perfect health. The reality was that he was falling apart years before the war even started. But here's what makes this truly chilling. The German people never suspected. Allied intelligence never caught on. Even historians missed it for decades after the war. The propaganda worked so well that the entire world believed Hitler was physically strong and mentally sharp until the very end. They were looking at a drug addict and seeing a Superman. And it gets worse, because Hitler's health problems made him the perfect target for exactly the wrong kind of doctor. Before Hitler became the Führer, he was just another anxious guy with stomach problems. And like many anxious people with mysterious health issues, he was desperate for answers. The stomach pain started in his 20s, cramping, bloating, constant discomfort. Sometimes the pain was so bad he couldn't eat for days. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. They tried different diets, different medications. Nothing worked. Then came the insomnia. Hitler would lie awake for hours, his mind racing, unable to shut off his thoughts. When he finally did sleep, he'd wake up exhausted. The lack of sleep made everything worse. The anxiety increased, the stomach pain intensified. He was trapped in a cycle. And here's where Hitler's personality became dangerous. He was a massive hypochondriac. Every ache was potentially cancer. Every pain was possibly an ulcer. Every moment of fatigue meant his body was failing. He was obsessed with his health in a way that made him vulnerable to anyone who promised a solution. Traditional doctors frustrated him. They were cautious, conservative. They offered boring solutions to what Hitler was convinced were serious problems. He wanted quick fixes. He wanted miracle cures. He wanted a doctor who would take his concerns seriously and act aggressively. He wanted someone like Theodor Morell. Now picture this. It's 1936. Hitler has been in power for 3 years. He's the most powerful man in Germany. He can have any doctor in the country. The best medical minds in Europe would jump at the chance to treat him. And he chooses a guy who most of the medical establishment thinks is a quack. Morell wasn't some distinguished physician. He wasn't a professor at a prestigious university. He ran a private practice in Berlin treating wealthy patients with unconventional methods. His specialty? Injections. Lots and lots of injections. Morell believed that most health problems could be solved by injecting the right combination of substances directly into the bloodstream. Vitamins, hormones, glucose, animal organ extracts, whatever might work. His approach was to throw everything at the problem and see what stuck. To legitimate doctors, this was reckless. To Hitler, it was exactly what he'd been searching for. They met at a party. Hitler complained about his stomach problems. Morell said he could help. Within weeks, Morell was giving Hitler regular injections. Within months, Hitler felt better. Within a year, Morell was Hitler's personal physician with unlimited access to the Führer. And here's the thing that sealed the relationship. Morell told Hitler what he wanted to hear. Other doctors had suggested Hitler's problems were stress-related, psychological, maybe even somatozoid. Morell said absolutely not. These were real physical problems that required aggressive medical treatment. Hitler was genuinely ill and Morell would cure him. Hitler was hooked, not on drugs yet, on the idea that someone finally understood him. But the drugs were coming. The first injection seemed innocent enough. Vitamins, glucose, something Morell called Vita Multin that was supposed to strengthen the intestines. Hitler felt better, more energy, less pain. He was convinced Morell was a genius. What Hitler didn't know was what else was in those injections. Morell's pharmaceutical approach was to mix multiple substances together in single injections. He'd combine vitamins with hormones, glucose with animal extracts, and he never told Hitler the full list of what he was getting. The injections were black boxes, mystery cocktails that Morell claimed were custom designed for Hitler's unique biology. In 1937, the injections became daily. Every morning, Morell would arrive at Hitler's residence with his leather medical bag. Hitler would roll up his sleeve, the needle would go in, and Hitler would start his day feeling energized and ready. He became dependent on that morning injection, not physically addicted yet, but psychologically convinced that he couldn't function without it. If Morell was late, Hitler would become anxious and irritable. He needed that injection to feel normal. And Morell noticed, because Morell was smart. He understood that the real power wasn't in curing Hitler. It was in keeping Hitler dependent on him. Every injection reinforced that dependence. Every improvement made Hitler trust him more. Every setback meant more experimental treatments. By 1938, Hitler was getting multiple injections per day. Morning injections for energy, afternoon injections for digestion, evening injections to help him relax. The frequency kept increasing, and Hitler never questioned it. He felt good. The injections worked. Why would he stop? Other people in Hitler's inner circle started to notice. His longtime secretary saw the injection routine and found it odd. Some of Hitler's generals thought Morell looked like a charlatan. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, called Morell the Reich injection master behind his back. But here's what's crucial. Nobody could say anything, because Hitler had complete faith in Morell. Criticizing Morell meant criticizing Hitler's judgment, and criticizing Hitler's judgment in Nazi Germany was a death sentence. So Morell had free rein, complete access, zero oversight, and a patient who would take whatever he prescribed without question. It was the perfect setup for disaster. In 1939, something changed in the injections. Hitler's energy levels shot up dramatically.
He needed less sleep. He could work longer hours. He felt sharper, more focused, more confident. He told people he felt like a young man again. What had Morell added to the cocktail? Methamphetamine. The drug was legal in Germany at the time, sold under the brand name Pervitin. German housewives took it to clean their homes with extra energy. Students used it to study all night, and the German military was issuing it to soldiers to keep them alert during long operations. Morell started adding it to Hitler's injections in small doses, then larger doses. And Hitler had no idea. He just knew he felt amazing. This is where everything started to go wrong. By 1940, Morell's medical bag contained a pharmaceutical arsenal that would shock modern doctors, and Hitler was getting regular doses of almost everything in it. Let's break down what was actually going into Hitler's body, because the list is absolutely insane. Pervitin. That's methamphetamine, the same drug that would later devastate communities across America as crystal meth. Hitler was getting it injected directly into his bloodstream multiple times per week, sometimes multiple times per day. Eucodol. That's oxycodone, a powerful opioid painkiller. Morell prescribed it for Hitler's stomach pain and headaches. But opioids don't just kill pain, they create euphoria, and they're incredibly addictive. Hitler was getting doses strong enough to knock out most people. Cocaine, not for snorting, as eye drops. Morell prescribed cocaine solution to be dropped directly into Hitler's eyes before important meetings and speeches. Cocaine absorbed through the eye goes straight to the brain. Hitler's pupils would dilate, his confidence would surge, he'd feel invincible. Testosterone and other hormones. Morell believed Hitler needed hormone replacement to maintain his vitality, so he injected animal hormones, bull testicle extracts, seminal vesicle extracts, substances that hadn't been properly tested or studied. Atropine, a substance that speeds up heart rate and can cause hallucinations in high doses. Morell used it to treat Hitler's digestive issues. Strychnine. Yes, strychnine. In small doses, it was thought to stimulate the nervous system. In large doses, it causes violent convulsions and death. Hitler was getting regular microdoses and dozens of experimental compounds, things Morell called vitamolten calcium or glyconorm or prostacrin, mixtures that Morell invented himself, combinations that had never been tested, substances that legitimate doctors wouldn't touch. The most disturbing part, Morell kept detailed records of all of this. He logged every injection, every pill, every treatment. Not because he was concerned about safety, but because he was proud of his work. He genuinely believed he was keeping Hitler alive and healthy with this chemical cocktail. By 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Hitler was getting between 5 and 8 injections every single day. His body was processing a pharmacy's worth of powerful drugs on a constant basis. And it was starting to show. People close to Hitler noticed changes in his behavior. His moods swung wildly. He'd be euphoric and confident one hour, then irritable and depressed the next. His temper became explosive. He'd rage at generals for minor mistakes. He'd become fixated on small details while ignoring major problems. His sleep schedule became chaotic. He'd stay up until 4 or 5 a.m., talking non-stop, his mind racing. Then he'd sleep until noon and wake up groggy and disoriented. The only thing that would snap him out of it was Morell's morning injection of methamphetamine. His eating became erratic. The digestive problems that Morell was supposedly treating got worse. Hitler would go days eating almost nothing, then suddenly demand strange food combinations at odd hours. His weight fluctuated. His skin tone changed. But here's the terrifying part. Nobody connected these changes to the drugs. They thought Hitler was under stress from the war. They thought he was working too hard. They thought the pressure of leadership was taking its toll. They never considered that their leader was being systematically poisoned by his own doctor. And the drugs were about to influence some of the most catastrophic military decisions in history. December 1941. Germany is at war with the Soviet Union, and it's not going according to plan. The Eastern winter is hit. German soldiers are freezing. Supply lines are stretched impossibly thin, and the Soviet army is counterattacking around Moscow. Every single one of Hitler's generals is telling him, pull back, retreat to defensive positions for the winter, regroup, resupply, launch a new offensive in the spring when conditions improve. It's the obvious military strategy. It's what any rational commander would do. Hitler refuses, absolutely refuses. He issues an order, not one step back. Every position must be held. Any officer who authorizes a retreat will be court-martialed.
His generals are stunned. This isn't just risky, it's suicidal. German soldiers are dying of frostbite. Equipment is freezing and breaking. They need to retreat to survive. Hitler won't hear it. He becomes furious when anyone suggests withdrawal. He accuses his generals of cowardice. He rants about willpower overcoming material conditions. He insists that German soldiers must stand and fight regardless of the circumstances. This is where the drugs start influencing history. Methamphetamine doesn't just give energy, it gives unshakable confidence. It makes someone certain they're right, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. It creates a sense of invincibility, and it absolutely destroys the ability to accurately assess risk. Hitler was making military decisions while high on methamphetamine, and methamphetamine was telling him he was a military genius who couldn't possibly be wrong. The not one step back order had mixed results. It did prevent a complete collapse of German lines, but it also led to catastrophic losses. Entire divisions were destroyed because they weren't allowed to retreat to defensible positions. Tens of thousands of soldiers died needlessly. And Hitler took exactly the wrong lesson from this fiasco. He concluded that his intuition was correct, that willpower could overcome reality, that his genius had saved the German army from defeat. The generals who had urged retreat, he started viewing them with suspicion. They were weak, defeatist. They didn't have his vision or his courage. He began replacing experienced commanders with officers who would follow his orders without question. This was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat throughout the war. Hitler would make an irrational decision, his generals would object, he'd override them, the decision would lead to disaster, and Hitler would blame the generals for not executing his brilliant plan correctly. Methamphetamine-fueled overconfidence was now driving German military strategy. But the drugs were just getting started. Theodor Morell was meticulous, almost obsessively so. He kept detailed records of every medical treatment he provided to Hitler. Dates, times, substances, dosages, reactions, all written in his barely legible handwriting. These logs are some of the most important historical documents of World War II that nobody talks about. Morell recorded over 800 injections between 1941 and 1945. That's the ones he wrote down. The actual number was certainly higher. And what those logs reveal is absolutely staggering. In a typical week in 1943, Hitler received multiple injections of Vitamoltin mixed with methamphetamine, at least 2 injections of Eucadol for pain, daily glucose injections, hormone injections every few days, and various experimental compounds Morell was testing. But here's what makes these logs truly disturbing. The dosages increase over time. What started as small amounts of methamphetamine in 1940 had tripled by 1943. The opioid doses kept climbing. The frequency of injections accelerated. This is textbook drug tolerance. Hitler's body was adapting to the drugs. The same dose that made him feel energized in 1940 barely registered by 1943, so Morell kept increasing the amounts. The logs also show something else: withdrawal symptoms. On days when Morell couldn't see Hitler or when injections were delayed, the notes describe Hitler as nervous, unwell, or irritable. These are classic withdrawal symptoms from stimulants and opioids. Hitler had become physically dependent on the drugs. His body couldn't function normally without them anymore. After the war, these logs were found by Allied forces. American military intelligence seized Morell's papers, and when they were finally analyzed by doctors and historians, the implications were shocking. Dr. Leonard Heston and Renata Heston, who studied the medical records extensively in the 1970s and 80s, concluded that Hitler showed clear signs of drug dependency and that the substances he was taking would have significantly impaired his judgment and mental functioning. Other historians have been more cautious, arguing that while the drug use was real, it's impossible to know exactly how much it influenced Hitler's decisions. They point out that Hitler was making terrible decisions before the heavy drug use began. But here's what's undeniable.
From 1941 onward, Hitler was making critical military and political decisions while under the influence of methamphetamine, opioids, cocaine, and a cocktail of other powerful substances. His brain chemistry was fundamentally altered. His perception of reality was being filtered through a pharmaceutical haze. And the decisions he made during this period became increasingly detached from reality. The people who knew Hitler before the drugs and after the drugs noticed a stark difference. The change wasn't subtle, it was dramatic and disturbing. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and later armaments minister, spent years in close contact with Hitler. He described the transformation in his memoirs. The Hitler of the late 1930s could be charming, engaged, even occasionally self-deprecating. The Hitler of 1943 and after was paranoid, explosive, and increasingly detached from reality. The mood swings became extreme. Hitler would be euphoric and grandiose one moment, convinced of imminent victory even as Germany was losing on all fronts. Hours later, he'd sink into deep depression, talking about betrayal and defeat. Then suddenly he'd rage, screaming, throwing things, threatening to have people shot for minor failures. These aren't the mood swings of someone under stress. These are the mood swings of someone whose brain chemistry is being violently manipulated by powerful drugs. The paranoia intensified dramatically. Hitler had always been suspicious, but by 1943, he trusted almost nobody. He became convinced his generals were plotting against him. He thought people were deliberately sabotaging his orders. He saw betrayal everywhere. Methamphetamine, especially with long-term use, can cause paranoid psychosis. Users become convinced that people are out to get them. They see patterns and conspiracies that don't exist. Hitler's increasing paranoia matched this profile perfectly. His ability to focus collapsed. Before the heavy drug use, Hitler could sit through long military briefings and grasp complex strategic situations. By 1944, his attention span had shrunk to minutes. He'd interrupt constantly. He'd fixate on irrelevant details. He'd lose track of what was being discussed. The temper was perhaps the most noticeable change. Hitler's rages became legendary among his staff. He'd scream at field marshals for hours over minor tactical decisions. He'd threaten to have people shot for bringing him bad news. The violent outbursts were so frequent that his staff learned to time their reports carefully, trying to catch him in a good mood. This temper is a known side effect of methamphetamine use, especially when the drug starts to wear off. The crash from meth can produce intense irritability and anger. Hitler was experiencing these crashes multiple times per day as the effects of his injections wore off. His physical deterioration was becoming visible too. By 1943, people who saw Hitler after a gap of months were shocked by how much he'd aged. His skin had a grayish tone. His posture was increasingly stooped. His hands developed a tremor that got worse over time. The tremor is particularly important. Hitler's left hand almost shook constantly by 1944. He tried to hide it by keeping his left hand behind his back or clasping his hands together. Some historians have attributed this to Parkinson's disease, and that may have been a factor, but the shaking is also consistent with stimulant abuse and neurological damage from drug use. People close to Hitler started whispering among themselves. Something was seriously wrong with the Führer, but nobody dared say it out loud. And Hitler himself, he was convinced he was healthier than ever, because every time he felt weak or sick, Morell would give him an injection and he'd feel better. The drugs were both the cause of his decline and his perceived solution to it. It was a vicious cycle that was about to influence one of the war's most catastrophic battles. August 1942. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, is advancing on Stalingrad. The city is strategically important, but it's also a symbol. It bears Stalin's name. Taking it would be a massive propaganda victory. The battle becomes brutal. Urban warfare, fighting block by block, house by house, room by room. The casualties are staggering on both sides, but the Germans are making progress. They control most of the city by November. Then the Soviet counterattack comes. On November 19th, Soviet forces launch Operation Uranus. They strike at the weak Romanian and Italian armies protecting the German flanks. Within days, they've encircled the entire German Sixth Army.
Over 250,000 German soldiers are trapped in Stalingrad. General Paulus immediately requests permission to break out. Military logic is crystal clear. The army needs to retreat while there's still time. They're surrounded. Winter is coming. They'll be cut off from supplies. Breaking out is the only rational option. Hitler's response is immediate and absolute. No. The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad. They will not retreat. They will be resupplied by air. They will hold their positions until relief forces can break through. Every single military advisor tells Hitler this is impossible. The Luftwaffe cannot supply an entire army by air through Russian winter. The numbers don't work. They'd need to fly in hundreds of tons of supplies daily. It can't be done. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, promises Hitler it can be done. He's either lying or delusional, probably both. Hitler seizes on Göring's promise. He becomes fixated on the idea. The Sixth Army will hold. They will not retreat one step. Their willpower will see them through. His generals are horrified. They beg Hitler to reconsider. They show him the logistics. They explain the reality. The army will be destroyed if it stays. Hitler explodes in rage. He accuses them of cowardice, of defeatism, of not believing in the German soldiers' ability to overcome adversity. He brings up the winter of 1941, when his not one step back order supposedly saved the army. He's convinced his intuition is right again. This is methamphetamine certainty. This is the absolute confidence that comes from stimulant use. Hitler is chemically incapable of acknowledging that he might be wrong. The airlift fails immediately. The Luftwaffe manages to deliver a fraction of what's needed. The soldiers in Stalingrad start starving, freezing, dying. By December, the situation is desperate. The Sixth Army is being systematically destroyed. Generals beg Hitler to let them break out. There might still be time. Hitler refuses. He promotes Paulus to field marshal, knowing that no German field marshal ever surrenders. It's a manipulation tactic. He's trying to ensure Paulus fights to the death rather than surrender. On February 2, 1943, the last German forces in Stalingrad surrender. The Sixth Army is annihilated. Over 100,000 German soldiers are dead. Another 90,000 are captured. Of those captured, only about 6,000 will ever see Germany again. It's the worst German military defeat of the war, a catastrophic loss that changes the momentum of the entire Eastern Front. And it happened because Hitler, high on methamphetamine and convinced of his own infallibility, refused to allow a rational military withdrawal. The drug-fueled decision cost Germany one of its best armies and marked the beginning of the end. After Stalingrad, something breaks in Hitler's connection to reality. But instead of pulling back on the drugs, morale increases them. Hitler is depressed, anxious, convinced people are betraying him, so morale gives him more injections to help with these feelings. By late 1943, Hitler's daily drug regimen is staggering. Methamphetamine in the morning, multiple times during the day if he has important meetings, opioids for pain that's now constant, sedatives at night because the methamphetamine won't let him sleep, then more methamphetamine in the morning because the sedatives leave him groggy. It's a pharmaceutical nightmare. His body is being whipsawed between stimulants and depressants, up and down, fast and slow. His brain chemistry is utterly destroyed. The physical symptoms accelerate. The tremor in his left hand becomes so bad that he can barely write. His left leg starts dragging when he walks. His posture becomes stooped, like he's aged 30 years in 3. His face develops a strange flatness, his expressions less animated. People who saw Hitler in person during this period described a shocking transformation. One visitor who hadn't seen him in 6 months barely recognized him. The man who once stood ramrod straight now shuffled into rooms bent over. His handshake, once firm and confident, was now weak and trembling. His eyes, which used to bore into people with intensity, were often unfocused and glazed. He starts having digestive crises so severe that he's bedridden for days. His stomach is essentially non-functional at this point, destroyed by years of drug use and stress. The pain is so intense that sometimes he screams. Morel responds by increasing the opioid dosages, which provides temporary relief but makes everything worse in the long run. But here's the truly insane part. Hitler still believes Morel is keeping him alive. Every time he feels terrible, Morel gives him an injection and he feels better for a few hours. Hitler interprets this as proof that the treatments work. He never makes the connection that the treatments are causing the problems. In fact, Hitler's faith in Morel becomes even stronger during this period. Other doctors try to intervene. They see what's happening. They understand that Morel is destroying Hitler's health, but Hitler won't hear criticism of his doctor. He fires anyone who suggests Morel's treatments might be harmful. He accuses them of jealousy or incompetence. The quality of Hitler's decision-making continues to deteriorate. He makes increasingly bizarre military orders. He insists on defending positions that have no strategic value. He refuses to allow retreats even when they're absolutely necessary. He becomes obsessed with wonder weapons that will turn the war around, despite having no basis in reality. The V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, secret weapons that supposedly will change everything. Hitler talks about these weapons with manic enthusiasm. He's convinced that Germany is on the verge of technological breakthroughs that will reverse the tide of the war. His generals try to explain the reality. The resources don't exist. The production can't keep up. Even if these weapons worked perfectly, they can't stop the combined forces of the Soviet Union, America, and Britain. Hitler doesn't want to hear it. The methamphetamine is telling him that victory is possible, that one brilliant move will change everything, that his genius will prevail. His relationship with his generals becomes openly hostile. He fires experienced commanders for disagreeing with him. He promotes younger, less experienced officers who will follow his orders without question. The German military command structure starts to collapse because competent leaders are being replaced with yes-men. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most experienced commanders, is fired. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, brilliant tactician, removed from command. General Heinz Guderian, pioneer of armored warfare, constantly battling with Hitler over strategy. The pattern repeats again and again. Competent leaders are pushed out. Loyalists who won't question orders take their place. The military briefings become increasingly surreal. Hitler will spend hours arguing over the placement of a single division while ignoring the collapse of entire army groups. He'll fixate on defending a town nobody's heard of while losing major cities. His strategic priorities make no sense. His tactical decisions are often contradictory. And through it all, the injections continue. Morel's logs from this period show an acceleration in frequency and dosage. Hitler is getting more drugs more often, and the effects are getting shorter. The tolerance has built to such a degree that massive doses barely produce the desired effect. In July 1944, a group of German officers attempts to assassinate Hitler with a bomb. The plot fails, but it confirms Hitler's paranoid worldview. He was right. People were plotting against him. This reinforces his distrust of everyone around him. The aftermath of the assassination attempt is brutal. Thousands of people are arrested, hundreds are executed. The trials are show trials, confessions are extracted under torture. Hitler watches films of the executions. He demands that the conspirators be hanged with piano wire so they die slowly. This isn't the response of a sane leader dealing with a coup attempt. This is paranoid revenge, methamphetamine-fueled rage combined with opioid-numbed empathy. Hitler is no longer capable of mercy or proportion. His inner circle shrinks to a handful of people: Martin Bormann, his private secretary; Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister; Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS; and Theodor Morel, his doctor. Almost everyone else is viewed with suspicion. The daily routine becomes increasingly rigid and bizarre. Hitler stays up until dawn, sometimes talking non-stop about architecture or history or his plans for post-war Germany. His staff is exhausted trying to keep up with his erratic schedule. He sleeps during the day, wakes in the afternoon, and begins his cycle of injections and meetings. His diet becomes even more erratic.
He'll eat nothing for days, then suddenly demands specific foods at odd hours. His weight fluctuates wildly. His complexion takes on an unhealthy gray tone. His hair, once dark, is now heavily grayed and thinning. But the most disturbing changes are behavioral. Hitler develops strange compulsions. He repeatedly washes his hands. He becomes obsessed with minor details while ignoring major problems. He has episodes where he seems to lose track of where he is or what he's doing. These are signs of serious neurological damage. The combination of long-term stimulant abuse, opioid use, and the various experimental compounds Morell has been injecting is destroying Hitler's brain tissue. The damage is likely irreversible at this point. By early 1945, Hitler is essentially isolated. He's moved into the Führer bunker in Berlin, a concrete shelter beneath the Reich Chancellery. He rarely goes outside. He sees fewer and fewer people, and Morell is still giving him injections multiple times per day. The bunker itself is a concrete tomb, damp, poorly ventilated. The air is stale and filled with diesel fumes from the generator. The constant sound of Soviet artillery above ground. It's a place where reality becomes even more distorted. The situation in the war is hopeless. The Soviets are approaching from the east. The Allies and British are advancing from the west. Germany is being systematically destroyed. Everyone around Hitler knows the war is lost. Everyone except Hitler, because the drugs won't let him see it. He still reviews maps showing German positions, still issues orders to armies that barely exist, still plans counterattacks with forces that have been destroyed. The gap between the reality of Germany's situation and Hitler's perception of it has become a chasm. And Morell keeps injecting him, because that's what Morell does. That's what Hitler demands. The doctor and his patient are locked in a death spiral, and neither one seems capable of breaking free. March 19, 1945. The war is clearly lost. Allied armies are inside Germany. Cities are being bombed into rubble. The German military is collapsing. In a rational world, this is when you try to minimize further damage, protect civilians, preserve infrastructure for whatever comes after defeat. Hitler issues the Nero Decree. The order is officially called the Demolitions on Reich Territory Decree, but it becomes known as the Nero Decree because it calls for the total destruction of Germany, not just military facilities, everything. Bridges, factories, railways, power plants, food supplies, communication systems. If the Allies are going to take Germany, they'll inherit nothing but ashes. The reasoning behind this order gives us a terrifying window into Hitler's mental state. He tells Albert Speer that the German people have failed him. They proved themselves weaker than the Eastern peoples. They don't deserve to survive. If they can't win the war, they deserve to be destroyed along with everything they built. This isn't military strategy. This is the delusional thinking of someone whose brain has been rewired by years of drug abuse. This is paranoid, narcissistic collapse combined with methamphetamine-fueled grandiosity and rage. Albert Speer, who has remained relatively loyal to Hitler despite everything, is horrified. He realizes that Hitler is no longer trying to save Germany. He's trying to drag the entire country down with him in a final act of destruction. Speer and other officials quietly sabotage the Nero Decree. They simply don't carry out the orders. They make excuses. They delay. They hope Hitler won't notice in the chaos of the final weeks. Hitler doesn't notice, because by this point, his connection to reality is almost completely severed. April 1945. Hitler is in the Führer bunker. Soviet artillery is hitting Berlin. The city is being destroyed block by block. The Third Reich has weeks, maybe days left. Hitler's physical condition is beyond anything Morell can fix. The tremor in his hands is constant and violent. He shuffles when he walks, barely able to move without support. His back is bent almost 90 degrees. His eyes are glassy and unfocused. His skin is gray and waxy. He's still getting injections multiple times per day, but they barely work anymore. His body has built up such tolerance that even massive doses of methamphetamine barely give him a few hours of alertness. The opioids don't kill the pain anymore. He's in constant physical agony. Witnesses from this period describe a man who barely resembles the Hitler from even a year earlier. He looks decades older. He moves like someone dying. He has episodes where he seems completely unaware of where he is or what he's doing.
Traudl-Jung, one of Hitler's secretaries who stayed in the bunker until the end, later described the surreal horror of those final weeks. Hitler would emerge from his rooms shuffling and bent, his left arm hanging uselessly, his hand shaking so violently he had to steady it with his right hand. His uniform, once immaculate, often had food stains. His hair was unwashed and greasy. But here's the most disturbing part. He's still making decisions. He's still issuing military orders. He's still commanding armies that barely exist to conduct operations that make no sense. He orders counterattacks with divisions that have been destroyed. He plans offensives with armies that have no ammunition. He's fighting a war that exists only in his drug-addled brain. The military conferences in the bunker become increasingly bizarre. Hitler pores over maps of Berlin, moving around markers representing units that no longer exist. He talks about relief forces coming to save the city. Army Group Steiner will attack from the north. The Ninth Army will break through from the south. Victory is still possible. His generals stand in silence. They know the truth. Army Group Steiner consists of scattered remnants with no heavy weapons. The Ninth Army is surrounded and fighting for survival. There will be no relief. There will be no rescue. Berlin will fall. Germany will be destroyed. But they can't tell Hitler this, because even in his deteriorated state, Hitler's rage is terrifying. When General Karl Koller tries to explain that the Luftwaffe can't stop the Soviet advance, Hitler explodes, screaming, accusing everyone of betrayal, threatening executions. The few people still around him don't know whether to humor him or try to force him to face reality. Most choose to humor him because the alternative is dealing with his rage. And even at the end, Hitler's rage is terrifying. The bunker atmosphere is nightmarish. The ventilation system struggles to clear the air. The smell of unwashed bodies, diesel fumes, and damp concrete pervades everything. The constant boom of artillery above ground shakes dust from the ceiling. People speak in hushed voices. Everyone knows the end is coming. Hitler's daily routine has become a twisted parody of normal life. He still has his meals at specific times, though he barely eats. He still holds conferences, though they discuss fantasies. He still receives his injections from Morell, though they barely help anymore. The injections themselves have become a problem. Morell is running low on supplies. The pharmaceutical supply lines have collapsed along with everything else. He's mixing whatever he has left, trying to create something that will give Hitler a few more hours of function. On April 16th, the final Soviet offensive on Berlin begins. Over 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by 6,000 tanks and 40,000 artillery pieces, launch the assault. The noise is deafening even in the bunker. The ground shakes constantly. Hitler's response is to plan counterattacks. He moves non-existent divisions on his maps. He issues orders that can't be carried out. He's completely detached from reality. And then Morell finally leaves. April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday. After nearly a decade of injecting Hitler with drugs, Morell just walks away. He doesn't say goodbye, he just leaves. Some accounts suggest Hitler dismissed him, others say Morell left of his own accord, realizing the end was near and wanting to save himself. Either way, Hitler is now without his doctor, without his regular injections, and the withdrawal symptoms hit hard. Without the methamphetamine, Hitler's energy collapses completely. He can barely stay awake. His already severe tremor gets worse. His mental clarity, already compromised, deteriorates further. He becomes even more confused and disoriented. Other doctors in the bunker try to help. They give him injections of vitamins and glucose, but it's not the same. Hitler's body has become dependent on Morell's specific cocktail. Without it, he's falling apart even faster. The bunker becomes a waiting room for death. Hitler stays in his private rooms more and more. When he does emerge, he's barely recognizable.
His movements are mechanical. His speech is slow and slurred. His eyes seem to look through people rather than at them. On April 22nd, Hitler has what witnesses describe as a complete breakdown. During a military conference, he suddenly starts screaming about betrayal. Everyone has betrayed him. The generals, the party, the German people. They're all worthless. They deserve to be destroyed. Then he collapses into his chair and weeps. This man who built an empire on projected strength is crying in front of his staff. He says the war is lost. He says he'll stay in Berlin and die in the capital. He says anyone who wants to leave should leave now. It's a moment of terrible clarity. For just a few moments, the drugs have worn off enough that Hitler sees the truth. Germany is destroyed. He's destroyed it, and there's no way out. But then, the moment passes, the denial returns, the delusion reasserts itself, and Hitler starts planning again. Maybe some units can still break through. Maybe some miracle will happen. The people in the bunker watch this disintegration with a mixture of horror and fascination. Some are still loyal, some are just trapped, but everyone understands they're watching the end of something terrible. Hitler's physical presence becomes almost unbearable to witness. The shaking, the dragging walk, the gray skin, the disconnected speech. One officer later described him feeling physically ill after spending time in Hitler's presence, not from fear, but from witnessing such severe physical and mental deterioration. The wedding to Eva Braun on April 29th is a surreal ceremony. Hitler can barely stand. His signature on the marriage certificate is shaky and barely legible. Eva Braun, who's been with him for years, finally gets what she always wanted, to be Mrs. Hitler. But she gets it for less than 40 hours before they both die. The bunker conferences continue. Hitler issues orders to armies that don't exist. He talks about relief forces that aren't coming. He discusses rebuilding plans for Berlin as the city burns above him. The disconnect from reality is total. Food becomes scarce. The kitchen staff does their best, but supplies are running out. Hitler barely eats anyway. He's surviving on his remaining drug cocktails and force of will, though even those are fading. The final days are a blur of confusion and desperation. Soviet forces are blocks away. The bunker is essentially surrounded. Escape is theoretically still possible through some tunnels, but Hitler has decided to stay. His staff urges him to flee. They have plans. They can get him out. He can continue the fight from Bavaria, from the Alps, from somewhere safe. Hitler refuses. Berlin is where he'll make his final stand. Berlin is where he'll die. People start leaving the bunker. Those who can make excuses and slip away do so. The circle around Hitler shrinks even further. By April 30th, only a handful of die-hard loyalists and trapped staff remain.
The last military conference is held around midnight on April 29th. Hitler reviews maps that are completely disconnected from reality. The units shown don't exist. The battle lines are imaginary. It's a conference about a war that's already over. Whatever thin connection he still had to reality has snapped completely. The man sitting in that concrete bunker, shaking and deteriorating, isn't commanding Germany anymore. He's commanding a fantasy. April 30, 1945, around 3:30 p.m., Hitler retreats to his private quarters with Eva Braun, the woman he married the day before. He takes a pistol. She takes cyanide. Both die within moments. But the hours leading up to that moment tell a story of complete collapse. That morning, Hitler was informed that Soviet forces were less than 500 meters from the Reich Chancellery. The battle sounds were now clearly audible, even in the deepest parts of the bunker. There was no more denying the reality. Berlin was falling. Germany was finished. Hitler spent the morning saying goodbye to his staff. The meetings were brief and awkward. He shook hands with his trembling, useless left hand. He spoke in a low, monotone voice. He had nothing inspiring to say, no grand final words, just brief farewells. He gave orders for his body to be burned after death. He was obsessed with the details. Make sure there's enough gasoline. Make sure the bodies are completely destroyed. He'd seen what happened to Mussolini, whose corpse was hung upside down in a public square and mutilated by crowds. Hitler wanted to avoid that humiliation at all costs. Around 2:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun retired to his private study. They closed the door. The staff waited outside in the narrow corridor. At approximately 3:30 p.m., a single gunshot. The staff waited a few moments, then opened the door. Hitler was slumped on the couch. A pistol lay near his right hand. Blood was draining from a gunshot wound to his right temple. Eva Braun was beside him, dead from cyanide poisoning. She'd bitten into a capsule. The smell of bitter almonds filled the room. The official cause of Hitler's death is suicide by gunshot, but his body was already shutting down. The autopsy reports that survived describe a physical wreck. His organs were damaged, his cardiovascular system was destroyed, his brain showed signs of significant deterioration. Doctors who later examined the medical evidence concluded that even if Hitler hadn't killed himself, he likely would have died within months from organ failure caused by years of drug abuse. His heart was enlarged, his liver was failing, his kidneys were damaged, his entire digestive system was non-functional. The methamphetamine had destroyed his cardiovascular system. The opioids had wrecked his digestive tract. The experimental hormones had disrupted his endocrine system. The combination of everything had caused widespread organ damage. Hitler was a walking pharmacy, and all those drugs had poisoned him from the inside. The staff carried out his wishes. They wrapped the bodies in blankets and carried them up the stairs to the Reich Chancellery garden. The Soviet shelling was intense, but they managed to place the bodies in a shallow shell crater. They poured gasoline over the bodies, approximately 180 liters. Then they lit them on fire. The flames rose high, but the shelling forced them back into the bunker before the bodies were completely consumed. The bodies burned for hours. When the fire finally died down, the remains were badly charred but still partially intact. Later, as Soviet forces closed in, the bodies were buried in another shell crater. Then, as Soviet forces got even closer, they were dug up and moved again. The Soviets found the remains on May 4th. They were suspicious. Stalin didn't trust that Hitler was actually dead. He thought it might be a trick, so they conducted multiple forensic examinations. The remains were badly damaged. The skull was fractured. The jaw was partially intact, and dental records eventually confirmed the identity. But Stalin kept the findings secret for years, alternately claiming Hitler was dead and suggesting he might have escaped. With Hitler died any chance of understanding exactly what the drugs did to his mind in those final years. The medical records exist. Witness accounts of his behavior exist. His increasingly irrational decisions are documented in military records. But nobody will ever know exactly what was happening inside his brain as it was being systematically destroyed by methamphetamines, opioids, cocaine, and a cocktail of experimental drugs. The bunker was eventually captured by Soviet forces. They found the remaining staff. They found documents. They found Morell's medical equipment, though Morell himself had fled days earlier. They found evidence of the pharmaceutical nightmare that had been playing out underground while the world burned above. In the days and weeks after Hitler's death, stories emerged from survivors. Stories about the shaking, the injections, the bizarre behavior, the disconnect from reality. But it would take decades before anyone put together the full picture of what had happened. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children, then killed themselves. Martin Bormann tried to escape and was killed. Heinrich Himmler fled, was captured, and took cyanide. The Nazi leadership disintegrated. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Over 60 million people were dead. Entire cities were destroyed. The Holocaust had claimed 6 million Jews and millions of others. Europe was in ruins. And at the center of all that destruction was a man who, for the final critical years, had been a drug addict. A man whose brain had been systematically destroyed while he commanded armies and made decisions about millions of lives.
The truth about Hitler's drug use was buried in the rubble along with everything else. It would take years of research, analysis of surviving documents, and testimony from witnesses before the full story emerged. But the evidence was there, in Morell's logs, in the injection records, in the testimony of people who watched Hitler's deterioration, in the medical analysis of his symptoms, all painting a picture of a man whose mind had been destroyed by the very treatments he thought were keeping him alive. After the war, Theodore Morell was captured by American forces. He was interrogated extensively about his treatment of Hitler. His medical logs were seized and analyzed. Morell had escaped from Berlin before the final collapse. He made his way to American lines and surrendered. When interrogators realized who he was and what he'd done, they couldn't quite believe it. The interrogations revealed a man who seemed genuinely oblivious to what he'd created. Morell maintained that he was simply treating Hitler's legitimate medical conditions. He insisted the injections were necessary and beneficial. He showed no awareness that he'd turned the leader of Nazi Germany into a drug addict. When American doctors examined Morell's records, they were stunned. The sheer volume of drugs, the combinations of substances, the increasing dosages. It was medical malpractice on a historical scale. Dr. John Thompson, one of the American military doctors who analyzed Morell's records, later wrote that he had never seen such reckless pharmaceutical treatment in his entire career. The combinations of stimulants and depressants, the experimental compounds, the complete lack of proper monitoring. It was, in Thompson's words, a systematic poisoning disguised as medical treatment.
The U.S. military considered prosecuting Morell for war crimes. After all, his treatment of Hitler had arguably influenced the course of the war. His drugs had impaired Hitler's judgment during critical military decisions. Could he be held responsible for the consequences? The legal experts concluded no. There was no precedent for prosecuting a doctor for treating a patient, even if that treatment was negligent and the patient was a war criminal. Morell hadn't killed anyone directly. He hadn't ordered atrocities. He was just a bad doctor with a famous patient. So Morell was released. He returned to his home near Lake Tegernsee in Bavaria. He lived quietly, rarely speaking about his time as Hitler's physician. When journalists tracked him down, he maintained that he'd done nothing wrong. In interviews, Morell came across as almost tragic in his self-delusion. He genuinely believed he'd helped Hitler. He thought his treatments had extended Hitler's life and improved his functioning. He couldn't or wouldn't see the obvious truth that he'd destroyed his patient's health and, in the process, possibly influenced the course of World War II. Morell died on May 26, 1948, at age 61. He died of obesity-related health problems, which is grimly ironic given how many health problems he'd caused for others. He was never prosecuted, never faced any serious consequences for what he'd done. He just faded away, a footnote in history. But the implications of what he did have fascinated historians and doctors ever since. The case raises profound ethical questions about medical responsibility, especially when the patient holds enormous power. In the decades after the war, as Morell's medical records became available to researchers, the full scope of Hitler's drug use became clear. Books have been written analyzing Hitler's drug use. Medical experts have debated what effects the substances would have had on his decision-making. Norman Ohler's 2015 book, Blitzed: Drugs in Nazi Germany, brought the story to a wider audience. Ohler's research into Morell's logs and other primary sources revealed the extent of drug use throughout the Nazi regime, with Hitler as the most prominent example. Dr. Fritz Redlich published a psychiatric study of Hitler in 1999 that examined the medical evidence in detail. Redlich concluded that Hitler likely suffered from multiple medical conditions, including Parkinson's disease, but that the drug use significantly worsened his physical and mental state. Historians have argued about how much the drugs contributed to Germany's defeat. Some argue that Hitler's drug-impaired judgment led to catastrophic military decisions that hastened Germany's collapse. Others contend that Hitler was making bad decisions before the heavy drug use began, and that the drugs were just one factor among many. The consensus is that the drugs didn't create Hitler's evil. He was a genocidal tyrant before Morell started the injections. The anti-Semitism, the militarism, the totalitarian ideology, those were already there. The Holocaust was planned and executed by many people, not just Hitler. The decision to start the war was made when Hitler was in relatively better health. But the drugs almost certainly made him worse. They impaired his judgment, they increased his paranoia, they disconnected him from reality. They made him incapable of accepting that he was losing the war. And here's where it gets really interesting. Some historians argue that Hitler's drug use may have actually shortened the war. Think about it. If Hitler had been thinking clearly in 1944-45, he might have negotiated a separate peace with the Western Allies. He might have made better strategic retreats that preserved German forces for longer defense. He might have avoided some of the most catastrophic decisions. Instead, his drug-impaired brain insisted on fighting to the last. No retreats, no negotiations, total commitment to a war that was clearly lost. This arguably saved Allied lives by shortening the conflict, even as it resulted in more German deaths. It's a grim calculus, but it's part of how historians now understand the final years of the war. The medical community has learned from this case. It's now taught in medical ethics courses as an example of what can go wrong when a doctor has unlimited access to a powerful patient with no oversight or accountability. Morell had no peer review, no ethics committee, no medical board to answer to, no one who could question his judgment or challenge his treatment plan. He had absolute power over Hitler's medical care, and that absolute power led to absolute disaster. Modern medical practice has safeguards specifically designed to prevent this kind of situation. Multiple doctors reviewing treatment plans, ethics committees overseeing experimental treatments, systems to ensure that even powerful patients receive proper medical care. The case also highlights the dangers of doctor-patient relationships where the patient is in a position of extreme power over the doctor. Hitler could have had Morell killed with a word. That power dynamic made it impossible for Morell to say no to Hitler's demands, even when those demands were medically harmful. It's impossible to know what would have happened if Hitler had received competent medical care. Would he have made better decisions? Would the war have ended differently? Would millions of lives have been saved or lost? History doesn't come with alternate timelines. We can only work with what actually happened. But what is clear is that for the final 3 years of World War II, one of the most powerful militaries in human history was being commanded by a drug addict, and that fact influenced events in ways we're still trying to understand. The story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about leadership, health, and power, about what happens when medical treatment becomes untethered from medical science, about the consequences when one person's chemical dependency intersects with their control over millions of lives. Here's what makes this story so disturbing. It was hidden for decades. The full extent of Hitler's drug use wasn't widely known until the 1980s and 1990s, when historians finally gained access to Morell's complete medical records and began analyzing them seriously. Why did it take so long? Several reasons, and they reveal a lot about how we prefer our history sanitized and simple. First, it was embarrassing. After the war, nobody wanted to admit that the Nazi leadership was being influenced by drugs. It made the entire conflict seem less like a battle between ideologies and more like a drug-fueled catastrophe. It was easier to maintain the narrative of evil but rational leaders making calculated decisions. The Allied governments had spent years depicting Hitler as a criminal genius, a brilliant strategist who had to be defeated by superior willpower and force. To then admit that he'd been a drug addict, making impaired decisions for years, that was complicated. It raised uncomfortable questions about how much of the war's outcome was due to Allied superiority versus German self-destruction. The German people, struggling to rebuild their country and their identity after the war, didn't want to hear it either. They needed to believe that what had happened to them was the result of a powerful, calculated evil, not a deteriorating drug addict who had driven their country into oblivion while high on methamphetamine. Second, Morell's records were messy and hard to interpret. His handwriting was barely legible. His medical terminology was often non-standard or completely made up. He'd invent names for his concoctions: Vitamoltin, Prostaclin, Glyconorm. Half the time, nobody could figure out what was actually in these injections. The sheer volume of the records was overwhelming. Morell documented everything obsessively, but the documentation was chaotic. Dates would be unclear, dosages would be recorded inconsistently, the same substance might be listed under different names. It took years of careful archival work to piece together what Hitler was actually receiving. Researchers had to cross-reference Morell's logs with pharmaceutical records from the era. They had to identify substances based on their described effects. They had to match up dates with historical events and witness testimony. Third, many people who witnessed Hitler's drug use died in the war or were killed in its aftermath. The SS officers who guarded Hitler, the generals who attended his conferences, many of them didn't survive to tell their stories. The few who did survive often minimized what they'd seen. Albert Speer, in his memoirs, mentioned Morell's treatments but downplayed their significance. He wanted to present Hitler as evil but rational, making calculated decisions. A drugged-out Hitler didn't fit that narrative. Other survivors had their own reasons for silence. Some were trying to protect their own reputations, some genuinely didn't understand what they'd witnessed, some were following the general post-war tendency to simplify and sanitize the story. But gradually, as historians pieced together evidence from multiple sources, the full picture emerged. Morell's logs, testimony from survivors, analysis of Hitler's behavior and recorded speeches and films, medical evaluation of his symptoms, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. The breakthrough came in the 1970s and 80s when historians gained better access to Soviet archives. The Soviets had captured many documents from the Reich Chancellery in the bunker. For decades, they'd kept these materials secret. When they finally allowed Western researchers access, new evidence emerged. Dr. Leonard Heston and Renat Heston published their study in 1979. They'd spent years analyzing Morell's medical records and comparing them with descriptions of Hitler's behavior from witnesses. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Hitler showed clear signs of drug dependency, and the substances he was taking would have significantly impaired his judgment and mental functioning. In the 1990s, more documents became available after the fall of the Soviet Union. Researchers found additional medical records, more testimony from witnesses who'd been in Soviet custody, more pieces of the puzzle. Werner Mazur's biography of Hitler, published in the 1970s, was one of the first major works to seriously examine the drug issue. Mazur interviewed surviving members of Hitler's inner circle and cross-referenced their testimony with the medical records. He concluded that drugs had played a significant role in Hitler's deterioration. By the 2000s, enough evidence had accumulated that the drug use was no longer controversial among historians. The debate shifted from whether Hitler was addicted to drugs to what effect those drugs had on his decision-making and the war's outcome. Norman Ahler's 2015 book, Blitzed, brought the story to mainstream attention. Ahler wasn't just looking at Hitler. He researched drug use throughout the Third Reich. German soldiers taking methamphetamine to stay alert, Luftwaffe pilots using cocaine, the entire Nazi war machine running on pharmaceutical enhancement. And at the top of this pharmaceutical pyramid was Hitler, getting a personalized cocktail of the most powerful drugs available, administered by a doctor who had no idea what he was doing. The story that emerged from decades of research is shocking but consistent. Multiple independent sources, documentary evidence, medical analysis, witness testimony, all pointing to the same truth. Hitler wasn't just an evil dictator. He was an evil dictator whose brain was being chemically destroyed while he commanded a military force that killed millions. And this raises uncomfortable questions that historians are still grappling with. How much of the catastrophic decision-making in the final years of the war was due to evil ideology, and how much was due to impaired brain function? There's no simple answer. Evil is evil whether the person is sober or high. Hitler was responsible for the Holocaust. He was responsible for starting the war. He was responsible for the deaths of millions. The drugs don't excuse any of that. But the drugs do help explain some of the inexplicable decisions. The refusal to retreat at Stalingrad, the Nero decree calling for Germany's total destruction, the increasingly irrational military orders, the complete disconnect from reality in the final months. These decisions seemed irrational even by Nazi standards. Even other Nazi leaders thought Hitler had gone crazy. And maybe he had.
Maybe years of methamphetamine, opioids, cocaine, and experimental drugs had literally driven him insane. The medical evidence certainly suggests it's possible. Long-term methamphetamine use causes paranoid psychosis. Opioid addiction impairs judgment and decision-making. The combination of stimulants and depressants can cause severe mood disorders and cognitive impairment. Hitler had all of these symptoms: the paranoia, the impaired judgment, the mood swings, the cognitive impairment, all consistent with the effects of the drugs Morell was giving him. Would the war have ended differently if Hitler had been sober? Impossible to say, but it's a question worth asking. Because understanding how Hitler's drug addiction influenced his decision-making helps us understand how the war unfolded, why certain battles were fought the way they were, why Germany didn't negotiate when negotiation might have been possible, why the Nazi regime chose total destruction over rational surrender. The drugs don't explain everything, but they explain some things that otherwise make no sense, and that matters for understanding one of the most important events in human history. The story of Hitler's drug addiction is more than just a bizarre historical footnote. It's a lesson about the danger of unchecked power combined with chemical dependency, and it's a warning that echoes through history to today. Think about what happened here. One doctor, no oversight, complete access to the most powerful person in Germany, and the freedom to inject him with whatever substances he wanted whenever he wanted. Morell wasn't trying to hurt Hitler, he genuinely believed he was helping. He thought his treatments were revolutionary. He saw himself as a medical genius keeping the Führer alive and functioning. But good intentions mean nothing when pumping someone full of methamphetamine and opioids without understanding the consequences. This is what happens when medicine becomes untethered from science, when treatment becomes experiment, when a doctor's ego and ambition override proper medical protocol. Morell was making it up as he went along, mixing substances that had never been tested together, increasing dosages without any scientific basis, playing with the health and mind of a man who controlled millions of lives. And the people around Hitler knew something was wrong. They could see the physical deterioration, the trembling hands, the stooped posture, the gray skin. They witnessed the mood swings and the irrational decisions, but nobody stopped it because nobody could stop it. This is what happens when power becomes absolute. When one person's judgment can't be questioned, when loyalty is valued more than truth. Criticizing the Führer's medical treatment meant criticizing the Führer himself, and that meant death. So they watched. Hitler's generals watched as his decision-making deteriorated. His staff watched as his health collapsed. His inner circle watched as he became increasingly paranoid and detached from reality. And they said nothing, because saying something was suicide. The Nazi system had created a situation where the leader's health couldn't be questioned, where proper medical care was impossible because it might imply the leader was weak, where propaganda about Aryan perfection made it impossible to admit that the Führer was sick. And in that environment, a quack doctor with unlimited access destroyed the health and mind of the most powerful man in Germany, while that man made decisions that killed millions. The drugs didn't make Hitler a monster. Let's be absolutely clear about that. Hitler was already a monster. He was a genocidal tyrant before Morell started the injections. The anti-Semitism was there. The militarism was there. The totalitarian ideology was there. The Holocaust was planned and executed by many people, not just Hitler. The decision to start World War II was made when Hitler was in relatively better health. The decision to implement the final solution wasn't made under chemical influence. Hitler's evil was his own. But the drugs made him a worse leader. They impaired his judgment at critical moments. They increased his paranoia when he needed clarity. They disconnected him from reality when he needed to see truth. They made him incapable of accepting defeat when rational acceptance might have saved lives. Think about the decisions that were influenced by his drug-impaired state. Stalingrad, where 250,000 German soldiers were sacrificed because Hitler couldn't admit retreat was necessary. The refusal to allow tactical withdrawals throughout 1944 and 1945. The Nero Decree calling for Germany's complete destruction. The insane military orders in the final months when the war was clearly lost. How many lives were lost because Hitler, high on methamphetamines, was absolutely certain he was right even when all evidence said otherwise? How many soldiers died because Hitler, in opioid-induced fog, couldn't process the reality of Germany's situation? How many civilians suffered because Hitler, paranoid from long-term stimulant abuse, saw betrayal everywhere and trusted no one? We'll never know the exact numbers, but we know the drugs influenced decisions, and those decisions had consequences measured in hundreds of thousands of deaths. And here's the truly disturbing part. This could happen again. Not in the same way, not with the same leader or the same drugs, but the underlying conditions, absolute power, no oversight, the inability to question the leader's health, those conditions can exist anywhere. History is full of leaders whose health problems influenced major decisions. Woodrow Wilson, incapacitated by a stroke, refusing to acknowledge his condition. JFK, taking powerful pain medications and steroids for his back problems. Leaders throughout history have made important decisions while dealing with health issues that affected their judgment. But Hitler's case is extreme because of the combination of factors: the absolute power he wielded, the horrific nature of the Nazi regime, the massive scale of World War II, and the sheer volume of powerful drugs systematically administered by a doctor who had no idea what he was doing. The medical community has learned from this. Modern medical ethics emphasize oversight and accountability. Even powerful patients need proper care. Even important leaders need doctors who will say no when treatment is harmful. The systems we have now are designed, in part, to prevent another Morel from destroying another leader's health. But we should never forget that it happened, that for nearly a decade, one of history's most evil leaders was also a drug addict, that the final years of World War II were influenced by a pharmaceutical catastrophe playing out in Hitler's body and brain. Over 800 documented injections, years of methamphetamine use, constant opioids, cocaine, testosterone, strychnine, atropine, dozens of experimental compounds, all flowing through Hitler's bloodstream as he commanded armies, ordered executions, and decided the fate of millions. The medical records survived, the injection logs exist, the witness testimony is documented, the physical deterioration is visible in photographs and films from the period. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Adolf Hitler was a drug addict. His doctor enabled and encouraged that addiction, and World War II paid the price in ways we're still trying to fully understand. The next time someone tries to tell you that history is simple, that World War II was just about good versus evil, remember this story. Remember that underneath the grand narratives and the ideology and the battles, there was a man destroying his body and mind with drugs while the world burned around him. Remember that power without accountability is dangerous, that medicine without oversight can be deadly, that leaders are human with human weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and that sometimes those weaknesses can have consequences that echo through history. This is the hidden truth of World War II, the secret medical catastrophe that influenced one of history's darkest chapters, the pharmaceutical nightmare that was buried in classified documents and witness memories for decades. But now we know, and knowing this changes how we understand the war. It doesn't excuse anything, it doesn't minimize Hitler's evil or the Holocaust or the millions of deaths, but it adds a layer of understanding to how events unfolded. It helps explain the inexplicable. It provides context for the irrational. It shows us that even the most carefully constructed public image can hide a devastating private reality. Hitler presented himself as superhuman. The propaganda machine depicted him as the embodiment of strength and discipline. The Nazi ideology required him to be perfect. The truth was that he was falling apart, physically deteriorating, mentally impaired, chemically dependent, a drug addict commanding a war machine that killed over 60 million people. That's the real story. That's the truth that was hidden for decades. That's the pharmaceutical catastrophe that helped shape World War II. And now you know it. The whole shocking, disturbing, unbelievable truth. A truth supported by documents, testimony, medical analysis, and historical evidence. A truth that changes how we understand one of the most important events in human history. History is never as simple as we want it to be. The truth is often stranger, more complex, and more disturbing than the stories we tell ourselves. And sometimes the most important truths are the ones that were hidden the longest. This is one of those truths, and it deserves to be told.